I know you're out there somewhere. 80s reference. Hi, Patreon, whatever the hell you're called. Thank you as always for supporting me. You don't know how much it means to me. It really means a lot. As much as I kvetch often about where's everybody else, see, honestly, you core people are like family to me. This is the Bonus MxTRA video for Season 6, Episode 20. And as promised, it's on the history of CDs. Last week I did history of cassettes. Last week meaning about 10 minutes ago, because I'm batch recording these, and you can see I have the same outfit on. This vintage U2 shirt from 1987 or something like that, 87, 88. So history of CDs. Here's the thing. I research all this stuff, and I find it super fascinating even before I know anything about it. And then as I'm learning, I realize it's even more fascinating. And I think that happened with cassettes. Even though I knew quite a bit of that, I didn't know all of it. And I found this chart online because I wanted to know not just the format, history, and blah, 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 and how it was developed, but like sales numbers and things like that, because I think that's kind of important, because music is commerce in many ways. And I'm going to do actually next week, my episode is a pod fast where I'm going to talk about music as commerce in a very weird way. Stay tuned for that. Those of you who've been hanging with me for a while will understand when I say the number 50,000. Anyway, this chart showed, it was one of those animated charts that would show like the bars moving as things would ebb and flow through the years from 73 to 2023 or something like that, 22. And it was fascinating to see like sales numbers for all these different formats, from vinyl to cassette to CD to 8-track to digital stuff and all. It was pretty awesome. And that's what some of this is. And so again, and I've said this before, I'm pretty excited to share this stuff. So the history of CDs. If you don't know, and you probably do, but whatever, CDs are a light or laser-based recording format. And I say that because it came from somewhere. It didn't just pop out of the blue like, let's make this disc that sort of looks like a small vinyl, but it's made of some kind of, poly material or whatever. Laser or light-based recording was first developed in what year? 70s probably, because that's when, CDs started, whatever, was it a little earlier the way some things like the microwave or cell phones or the internet, or was it? No, 1931 was when the first light-based recording was developed. 1931, just shortly after the first reel-to-reel in the 1920s, just a few years later, if you saw my cassettes history. But it wasn't put into any serious use until the 1960s and 70s. So a lot of time went by. They didn't know what to do with it. By the late 1970s, video laser discs were being sold. And for those of you who was ever with a cinephile, I guess you would call them, people of a certain age had collections of laser discs because technically their quality was just head over heels better than VHS or beta or anything like that. And some would say even better than DVDs. When I started working at the zoo in 2005, there was the Congo exhibit, and many exhibits there had video. And so part of my job was to control audio, video, to take care of it, manage it, whatever. And until we did a full changeover, when I was there, this must have been an exhibit that was put in the 90s, was using Laserdisc for those videos. It's pretty freaking awesome to handle Laserdisc. They're huge. They're way bigger than vinyl. But at any rate, late 70s Laserdiscs were being sold, which was just a few years after the first VHS was sold. So not, they came kind of back to back. They were sold for quite a few years, but they never really took off because they were too expensive. And when you had cheaper options like VHS and eventually DVD, who would need to spend money on a Laserdisc? There's always these jokes about how Laserdisc people are like dorks or creepy or whatever. And I don't know, whatever. But when Laserdisc kind of morphed into DVD technology in the mid-90s, that's when the market exploded in conjunction with the CD explosion. We're going to get there. I'm just jumping ahead a little bit. Let's go back to the late 70s. It was the marketing of Laserdiscs that prompted companies to create a comparable audio format. They said, well, if we can do this for video, why can't we do it for audio? If you saw the history cassettes I just did, you might remember that the first mass-marketed cassette was developed by the company Philips. Philips And that was in the frickin' 50s, I think, right? Or early 60s. Philips partnered with Sony, again, Philips, in the late 1970s to develop the CD. So this company, with just a decade or two in between, seminal in the development of two huge formats. But the development of CDs was the opposite of the development of cassettes. Cassettes had a long life, as I mentioned, as a recordable format, and were only used as recording, weren't sold as pre-recorded for a long, long time. And then they were, and then that was that, and then both existed. CDs, for a long time, as you may remember, were only pre-recorded, about a decade or so, until recordable CDs came to be, and then even a little longer until they became affordable, especially the machines themselves. So that started as pre-recorded by this format. First commercially produced CD, meaning company, made the CD, was a 1979 recording of Chopin's waltzes. That wasn't sold until 1982. So it was commercially produced in 79. So the technology was around to actually produce CDs, audio CDs by then. 82, though, marks the debut of commercially sold CDs. There are many sources that say ABBA was the first one. Billy Joel's reissued 52nd Street was the first one. The Bee Gees album of the time was the first sold CD. But the truth, The Living Eyes, it was called. But the truth is, the Bee Gees album was the first mass manufactured CD in 1981. But there isn't really any one album that can be said to be the first CD ever sold, because the records aren't there. Because there were 50 albums released in 1982. First, I believe, in Japan and then in the U.S. in late 82, which is similar to the first cassette batch of cassette albums released in 66, I guess, in the U.S. were 49 of them. So that just seems like a number they always landed on. So there were 50 albums that vied for the candidate of, whatever, the moniker of the first CD ever sold in the world. First CD album. Very eclectic mix, too. Included jazz and all, newly reissued, new albums and reissued albums and all this. Just a real eclectic mix of music, those first 50. It's pretty easy to find the list online. I'm not going to mention it here. Just go ahead and look for it. It's really kind of a cool list from 1982. CDs were very much bubbling under in the early 1980s. They started to grow a little more rapidly after Sony released, as we know, let's go back. Sony released a Walkman in 79. And you would think, all right, well, cassettes in the 80s, CDs, whenever, it would take longer. Nope. 5 years later, Sony released the Discman in 1984. I remember in high school, this kid who I assume was rich, no idea, had one of the first Discmans ever. And I was like, oh, man, I'm never going to be able to get one of those. And sure enough, it took me about 10 years to get one. But it's partly because I waited until anti-skip technology came along. But also money. They were real expensive in the 80s. Discman, everything about a CD was. My family got their first home CD player in the late 80s. So you could see how in early 80s they existed, but nobody paid much attention. In the late 80s, people were starting to get the actual machines to play them. And we'll talk about the various CD machines a little bit later. I got my first CD machine in the early 90s when I left home, and I believe it was a 5-disc changer, a multi-disc, 5 or 6 discs. Eventually, decade or two later, my brother got like one of those towers that's both a storage device and a CD player, and it was like 100 discs that could rotate to like a freaking jukebox. And then he got rid of that too because it's all streaming now. CD machines, right, were always more affordable than recordable machines, but the players did start out pretty expensive, the way all technology does. First ones in 1982 were sold for around $1,000. That's why not many people bought CDs. They rapidly dropped in price over the decade to the point where my parents could afford one in the late 1980s, and I could afford one in the 90s. From 1984 to 90, coincidentally, the time when cassettes were dominant, CD sales rose rapidly from about 7% in 84 to about 50%, which is when they overtook the sales of cassettes. and kind of never looked back, at least cassette-wise. CDs had already overtaken the sales of vinyl in 1986. So they were introduced commercially in 82. 4 years later, they would overtake the format that was dominant for decades. It would only take 4 years. Sales would continue to rise of CDs after 1990 and would dwarf all other formats through around 2003, when they peaked at 96% of the market share. No other format in the history of music, not even streaming, is as high as 96%. CDs still, to this day, remain the highest market share format for music. And I don't think that's ever going to change. As dominant as streaming is right now, there are enough of these other formats to eat away at that 96%. So you see how amazing it is that one format like the CD left only 4% of the market share for every other format that existed at the time. Over the next 15 years, from 2003 on, they would slowly lose 90% of that market share. So goodbye dominance. First, digital downloads ate away at them, and then streaming ate away at that. Today, CDs account for less than 3% of sales. I mentioned that in the cassettes bonus. The digital downloads are slightly more than 3%, so they're around equal. But that's it for today, 3%. Not much, right? In the midst of all that, a few other things happened. It's more than just about CD sales. By 1984, you could get a car with a CD player, though I'm sure it was too expensive for most people, and it wasn't standard until, I think, the late 90s. It was an option up until then. And then it wasn't standard after that. Now you can't hardly get one with a CD player, and really, who needs it? I remember, though, through the late 90s and maybe even into the early 2000s, definitely through the 90s, I had one of those cassette to CD player adapters, so I could play my, like, 'cause I have my Discman or CD Walkman, it was called at the time, and connect it to the cassette player in the car to play it through the car system. Sort of like Bluetooth, but with wires, right? The recordable CD was developed in 1988, and the first recording machines were available commercially in 1990. So everybody bought one. No, they didn't, because they cost $35,000. Now, over the next few years, that would drop to around $10,000, which is why you had a ton of CD albums and singles and everything being, sold from 82 on and dominating in the early 90s and beyond. But nobody was using them to record anything until the late 90s, because by 95, still, those machines cost $1,000, which was the highest a CD player ever cost. So recordable CDs weren't a part of anyone's lives till the late 90s, when CDR and CDRW, meaning rewritable, you could re-record, were finally within reach for most consumers. Now, today, you can get a CD recording machine for about $20. So from $35,000 to $20. Right? Obsolescence. Shortly after the recording devices became affordable, CDRW was introduced. Once you could rip and reuse CDs the way you could cassettes, that's when recordable CDs really took off. People would use them for data, small videos, although DVD-Rs would come soon anyway. Mixtapes morphed from cassettes to CDs. By the late 1990s, CDs were affordable enough for indie musicians to release their music on them. And my first album released on CD was 1998's Listen You People. I then released one bootleg album on CD after that, and then I then released two official albums, then a bootleg, and then one more album. So only 5 of my albums were released on CD, and about the same on cassette prior to that, I want to say, yes. And most of those were EPs, frankly. And then after 2007, I haven't released a single damn thing on CD. By the 2010s, I stopped using CDs for almost everything, including data, because thumb drives were dominant then, and then eventually cloud sharing took over that. And I bought a couple of CDs after 2011 because I wanted to complete my collection, like Prince's last couple of CDs, etc. But honestly, that's it. Some people have given me CDs since then, but really my collection kind of stops pretty hard in 2011 and just trickles off after that. And all of my mixes went from cassettes to CDs, and now they're just all online. I haven't done a physical mix in a really long time. Now, while CD sound quality can vary based on how the files are compressed, in general, CD sounds about as good as digital or streaming, and the highest sound quality you can get. There are proponents of analog sound, similar to people who love shooting photography on film or video on film instead of digitally, and I get it. Because there are spaces in between the ones and zeros of digital. You can only cut them in half and half and half and half. You can only do that. You can do that infinitely to the point where you'll never get in all the spaces in between. Analog covers all those spaces in between, so I get that. Nevertheless, I think, yes, aesthetically, say whatever you want. It's your opinion, yes. But objectively and scientifically, you cannot get higher quality physical format for music than a CD. Sorry. Digital now even more. Non-physical even more. They're the truest to what the original sound was. Depending how they're produced, production could suck, or the way it's formatted could suck, but that the capturing of the recording and the sharing of it, it just is. Doesn't mean it's my favorite. It was my favorite for a number of years. It's why I have hundreds of CDs still, and that's half of what I used to have, or 2/3. Anyway, the shelf life of a CD is said to be about 20 to 100 years, at which point it deteriorates to where you can't hear what's on there anymore, depending on the quality of the disc and how the audio was burned onto it. But some of the mixes I made in the early mid-2000s are already blank or have one song. Thank God I put the list down so I know what was on there. I could recreate them. And I have recreated them digitally, actually. If you go to my Spotify or YouTube, you'll see all of those. But I got to be honest, I'll be curious to see how many of the CDs in my collection will be playable when I have grandkids, or great-grandkids or whatever. I keep my CDs because they're precious to me, the way I keep vinyl or cassettes. And in some ways, even though I prefer the cassette sound to vinyl and prefer the CD sound to cassette, and I love how it's like a mini vinyl, and so the insert can be very similar. And because I loved designing inserts for CDs, the way I love designing graphics today, I don't use them really unless I say, "Hey kids, this is a CD, and I can put this in the player that I still have, and this is what it sounds like," whatever. They don't care. But that's, something. It's one of those things where you have a collection of stuff and you're like, I'm only keeping it for nostalgia. There's no actual practical use. And yet there was a time when CDs had 96% of the market value. Just remember that. Highest ever. I'll talk to you next week.